Hi, I'm Dr. Keith Johnson. In most of the Bibles, and there are many versions of the Bible written these days, you have a division of the Old and New Testament. Now you're probably very much aware of that if you're a reader of the Bible at all, but let me explain to you some of the reasons that that's significant. The Old Testament is written at the time before Christ, and then the division is into the New Testament, of course, which is the times after Christ, after the year of our Lord, so that what happens before Christ becomes significant, during his birth very significant, of course, and then becomes the division when you have the New Testament, beginning of the Gospels. Now, very significant in the Bible is the fact that it says Jesus was born in the fullness of time. Now, what does that mean? It means a lot of things. It means it was time for him to come. It was a good time for him to be born. It was the time of history when all of the world was coming together. Now let me try to explain that to you. When the world finally came together, you already have, for example, the Greek education and philosophy. You have the Greek understanding of how it thinks and mythology and what it has to offer us. At the same time, you have in the same world the Roman legislature and the architecture that the Romans brought us. In fact, the saying, all roads lead to Rome, is very true, because in the Roman world, all roads were leading to Rome. They all came in because that's where the legislature took place. That's where the rulings of guiding and guarding the people took place. So you have the education of the Greeks that have come into the world, and we're all studying that education. Then the legislation of the Romans that have taken over the government, which, by the way, is very much disdained by the Hebrews. Now the Hebrews have also brought us our theology, or our religion. So you have brought together at least 3 points: architecture and science, education and religion, brought by the Romans and the Greeks and the Hebrews. Then you start to study how people put this together in legislation, and how they start to rule each other, and how certain kingdoms like the Romans took charge, and everybody hated them because of the way they took charge. But on the other hand, the Romans not only brought us system and study and an understanding of architecture and how the roads would run, and how the water would move into our system, and how we could guide the rivers to be a part of making the cities what they became. So you've got at least 3 different worlds: religion and education and architecture and legislation being put together, so that when Jesus is born, all these people have gathered under Roman government, they've gathered under Roman rule, they've gathered under Greek education and religious theology. All these people have gathered to study. The worlds are brought together in such a way that all 4 legislations have brought us to understand each other and to get to know and meet people, although there wasn't a lot of meeting people, because, for example, the Hebrews were very angry with the way the Romans were running their world, and they made it very clear when the Romans, as you remember, were in Jerusalem and running the government, and they had to listen to the people, the Jewish people, who insisted that Jesus be crucified. And you remember that they were very much against it because it wasn't part of their ruling, it was part of their kingdom. But they did what the theological group had them do. They followed the rules and tried to understand the history and tried to keep peace within the city as best they could. Remember, it was Pontius Pilate who found no fault in Jesus and tried to communicate that to the people. But when the people didn't accept it, they said, take him away, we want him crucified anyway, and Jesus was crucified. But Jesus is born in a world that is brought together by education and by architecture and by legislation and by theology, so that when he is born, the entire world knows it. It's brought together, it becomes a part of the kingdom, we become a part of the world, and that's where we begin to get our government and understand what's happening, brought together under Roman rule, So the world is together in education, in theology, in architecture, and all the things happening that make it a world that puts it together, puts it where it's working towards our government. When Jesus was born, all the world could know it. The Hebrews had to take note, Greeks had to take note, Romans had to take note. Anyone living in the area would have to listen and take charge of it. Remember, one of the arguments was, can anything good come out of Nazareth when they were talking about Jesus? The truth of the matter was, the Nazarenes were hated because they were under Roman rule and seemed to follow the politics of what was going on. And it was the Jewish people who were anxious to see some of the Roman rule against it. Although you can't blame the Jewish people altogether. You're dealing with politics, and like our world, a lot of different folks, a lot of different crimes, a lot of different passions that are taking place in each case. So in developing and trying to understand how the world is operating, when Jesus is finally born, he's born in a world that is pulled together by Roman and Greek and Hebrew theology and science and architecture, so that when he comes, the world is able to listen to him, and he's able to grow up in a world that is brought together. When the time was full and it was time for Jesus to show up, he did. And here's the reason I'm telling you all this, or at least trying to. Same thing is true today. Under the United States, the world is brought together. Under our government and our legislation and our architecture, we become a point where the world considers whatever is going on, so they look to us for guidance and direction, and sometimes not. Sometimes they fight against us. But they know to fight against us because they feel we're too strong. So the United States becomes like the Roman government, bringing the world together and demonstrating its architecture. The United States is doing its best to make this the fullness of time. We have all the education we need. We have all the religion we need, all the theology. We have all the rules we need mandated. So it's all here, and it's all there for us to look at. On the basis of this experience, we're at a world of full time. We're at the fullness of time, just like when Jesus came the first time. And I think you can begin to gather my point. We're at a fullness of time now where Jesus is coming. In fact, Jesus warned us, look up. It's very possible that I may show up when you least expect me. In fact, he said he wouldn't show up when we least expect him. And not only that, but we're in trouble with whatever Jesus would do if we're not following and bringing his will to the earth. It's very possible that Christ could come today. The fullness of time is here. The time to understand what's going on. Everybody looks to the United States for some guidance. At the same time, looks for the becoming bigger superpowers so it can figure out how to handle the world around us. At this point is a good time for Jesus to show up. And he warned us when we least expect him, we need to look up, for our redemption draws nigh. Are you expecting Christ? He could show up today. He may be here, and you and I may be up there any second. Look up, for your redemption draweth nigh. Jesus is coming, and there was never a better time than now.